The generation of Germans born after World War II couldn't look into the past for national pride, so instead they looked into the future, and musically that manifested with the experimental genre of Krautrock, also called Kosmik Music, or German for cosmic music. A very broad genre of experimental rock from West Germany first developing in the late 60s. This music was very avant-garde and experimental, often freeform and using tape machines and early synthesizers. The scene was too diverse to really summarize here. Krautrock was just an umbrella label to describe all these developments in Germany at this time. A huge influence on this movement was the works of Karlheinz Stockhausen, an experimental German composer that introduced controlled chants of randomness into his compositions of his electronic instruments. His work would be very influential on many bands who were inspired to experiment with electronics and tape machines, such as the Beatles, including his face on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's, reflecting his influence on the band's own experimental works of tape machines. And both Can and Kraftwerk both cite Stockhausen as an influence. While the term cosmic music is often used to mean the same thing as Krautrock, it more specifically describes the electronic side, using synthesizers to create ambient spacey soundscapes such as bands like Tangerine Dream, with their groundbreaking ambient electronica which would influence all ambient electronic music afterwards. However, our focus of today is two men, Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider, both students at the Robert Schumann University of Music and Media in the late 60s, who would make two freeform experimental albums titled Kraftwerk and Kraftwerk 2 in 1970 and 72, all using traditional acoustic instruments but adding electronic tape effects in post. With their third album in 73 titled Ralf and Florian, they finally started using synthesizers, drum machines, and vocoders. However, they finally hit it big in 1974 with Autobahn, based entirely out of synths, and moving away from freeform music for a more simple and pop-accessible sound, which got them to number 5 on the Billboard charts. With this, they would change their image and start over with a four-man lineup, now adding Wolfgang Flür and Karl Bartos, an iconic lineup lasting until the late 80s. They made Radioactivity in 1975, a more slow and ambient album exploring themes of both radio and radiation. However, they really hit their stride with the next three albums, all extremely important classics: Trans-Europe Express in 1977, The Man Machine in 1978, and Computer World in 81. The group used many custom-built instruments, such as the vocoder and electronic drum kit, which they patented in 1975 but was first used in 73. This machine is the first electronic drum kit, and it was specifically made by Kraftwerk. This really put them ahead of the game in the percussion department, as almost no one else was using drum machines, especially in 1973. For comparison, this is what the Roland CR-78, the first programmable commercial drum machine, sounded like that came out 5 years later. You can see why most musicians prefer to use a live drummer instead. The so-called Sensonorma sequencer was commissioned by the band and had up to 32-step sequencing with features commercial products just didn't have. Visually, they presented themselves to the public as, well, robots. Most famously by how they portrayed themselves on the cover of Man Machine in matching red getup with glowing buttons on their ties. Musically, these classically trained musicians focused on simple, repetitive melodies. And if you listen to the albums in their entirety, they will often repeat melodic ideas in the interludes between songs to connect the whole thing together. The percussion was robotic and straight, but syncopated. It would typically only use a kick and snare and never overlap them, but the way they played would anticipate the type of drum patterns people would naturally find themselves programming on drum machines in the 80s. The strongest beats in Western 4/4 music is of course the 1, 2, 3, 4. Most Western music that follows the tradition of blues music such as R&B, rock, and jazz brings emphasis on the beats 2 and 4, called the backbeat. It's the beat that people clap to. And in Kraftwerk's music, they tend to do a snare on the 2 and 4 with a kick drum on strategic weak beats in between. This is called syncopation, when you hit the weak beats in between the strong beats of 1, 2, 3, and 4. The unexpected kick drum patterns and rhythmically interesting spaces makes the music more groovy and funky than you might expect. Most importantly is the song Numbers, which features a very unique sequence of bleeps and bloops, but the drum pattern of the song, which goes, would become very, very commonly used. You might not think of this as conventionally dance music, but this is a song of theirs that DJs love to play. The band that was so different from any of the pop music, they referred to their music as robot pop, and laid the foundation for all synth pop afterwards. melodies were simple but genius in their simplicity, cheery but had an almost bittersweet melancholy to it, a balance between sounding cold and robotic and sounding warm and human. Tracks like Hall's The Mirror would anticipate more slow, minimal melancholic synth-pop such as in Depeche Mode.
Discover themselves in the looking glass. Little 15.
The sound design was so alien and unique that it was such a huge source of sampling in all genres of music, and not just in hip-hop.
Bounce if you wanna bounce, ball if you wanna ball, play if you wanna play, floss if you wanna.
Not to mention being the huge catalyst for electro and techno music, often now referred to as the first techno group retroactively due to being such a huge catalyst for it.
When they come to me, I'll make your fans step forward and other rappers flee. Ask me about my skills and I reply top shelf. Ha ha ha. To tell the truth, I amaze myself at how am I so.
The vocals are often done in a very deadpan and robotic way, but very rhythmic as well. This type of singing is often emulated in a lot of house and techno and any electronic genre, really. The uplifting and simple melodies would be used as influence in many, many songs afterwards. The entire genre of electro is built under a style of drum programming. I can't even begin to explain how much it shaped the landscape of electronica right now, because almost every artist I will talk about for the rest of the video will quote them as an influence. So I guess I should move on to another pioneer. Yellow Magic Orchestra, or YMO, is a Japanese band that originally conceived to be a one-time exploration of computer music and traditional oriental sounds made up of 3 veterans of the music industry. Yukihiro Takahashi, who played drums, Ryuichi Sakamoto, who played keyboard, and Harumi Hosono, who played bass, all of which had long careers in the music industry beforehand. It was formed by Hosono, the bass player, who simply recruited the other 2 as session musicians to make a disco-influenced band with potential to reach success outside of Japan. Tired of the Japanese music of the time emulating the sound of Western music, and inspired by the sound of Kraftwerk, which sounded distinctly German, they wanted to make a Kraftwerk-esque group that evoked the sounds of Japan, and you can see the Kraftwerk influence in their fashion as well. While Kraftwerk was dark and minimal, they wanted to evoke the more cheery and happy sound of a funk disco flair inspired by Giorgio Moroder, who I'll cover soon enough. They were also inspired by and sampled the music of arcade games, which can be heard all over the self-titled chiptune Exotica Funk album in 1978. It would make use of traditional oriental scales to evoke the distinctly Asian sound of the melodies and took inspiration from traditional Japanese and Chinese music. The big single Firecracker, or computer game as it was labeled in America, would chart on the US billboards, but is in fact a cover of a 1959 Exotica song by the same name by Martin Denny, which was a Westerner intentionally trying to sound oriental, which is in a way very fake and inauthentic. So YMO wanted to take that and make it from an oriental perspective. Exotica itself is a genre of music named after Martin Denny's album of the same name from 1957, aimed at older Americans to emulate the tribal sounds of Pacific Islanders in Asia based on what Westerners imagined they would sound like, but not actually authentic. The target audience being the older generation Americans who were stationed in the Pacific during World War II. Yellow Magic aimed to take that sound and make it more authentic and fuse it with electronica as a juxtaposed irony. After their first album was Solid State Survivor in 1979 with more of the same. One of the big hits from Solid State is their song Behind the Mask. Michael Jackson intended to sing over with new lyrics for his album Thriller, which would become the best-selling album of all time. But despite the approval from the band, legal issues of management prevented it from being on the album. However, a reworked version of MJ's cover can be heard on his posthumous album Michael in 2010. song was on the best-selling album of all time. Crazy to think about. The band would change their sound completely for their album in 1981 titled BGM, standing for Background Music. This album moved away from the chiptune funk for a more down-tempo sound and is the first music album to feature the TR-808 drum machine, the direct successor to the CR-78 that had a more intuitive design and flow that all other drum machines would build off of after this. YMO was the first group to use this drum machine in live performance as soon as it came out in 1980, and its use of the 88 would influence future usage. Specifically, Sakamoto's song Raya and Lagos from his solo work would be quoted as a huge influence on electro. BGM would show glimpses of future genres like ambient house and techno, and would be quoted as influenced by ambient house producers The Orb and 808 State. Its skittish and seemingly glitchy drum programming on the tracks UT and Camouflage sounds like IDM along the lines of Aphex Twin. As well as the album title, Background Music, and the album cover, as well as some of the ideas explored through the album would be a sort of proto-vaporwave in a way. Coming out the same year in 1981 was the album Technodelic, considered to be the first album made up mostly of digital samples, influenced their use in popular music. Digital sampling was possible at the time, but the device was very limited in the sample size and extremely expensive, with devices like the Fairlight CMI going for $40,000 in 1982. YMO used the LMD649, a custom-built sampler developed by Kenji Murata for the band, and was the first PCM digital sampler. This album being the first of its kind would have an influence on the future of sampling. YMO was the most popular band in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s, with 2 of their albums holding the top 2 spots in the charts for 7 weeks, being the only band in Japan to do so. It gratefully influenced Japanese pop music in the 80s, which incorporated more electronic sounds due to them, as well as having a huge influence in video game music of 8 and 16-bit eras. The reason why I bring up Kraftwerk and Yellow Magic Orchestra first is because of the huge influence in the growing hip-hop scene. YMO's Firecracker was so big in the growing hip-hop community, they even appeared on Soul Train in 1980, a live television show showcasing artists of R&B, soul, and funk music, being the only Japanese band to do so.
That wasn't part of the script. Let's get everybody's name.
Hosono.
Ako?
Kenji.
Yuki.
Ryuji.
It's difficult pronunciation.
Yeah. Let's see if somebody offered me $1 million to tell you somebody's name up here. You know I couldn't collect it, right? You think your sound, which of the current sounds do you think Yellow Magic Orchestra is close to?
Someone said, like a Kraftwerk. Do you know Kraftwerk?
Of course. No, I'm not familiar with the record, and I'm sorry. But we're awfully glad to have you with us.
Chicago, first it was just suppress it. This is hip house and not acid. With a hint of techno bass, we just chill, cause we want to set the pace. I program my own computer. Beam myself into the future.
They would pay homage to hip-hop on BGM with the song Rap Phenomena because of this. The first hip-hop songs in the late 70s such as Rapper's Delight and The Breaks were rapping over funk instrumentals and clearly drew from that lineage of dance music. That changed with Africa Bambaataa, a New York DJ in the early hip-hop scene who would often play Kraftwerk music on his sets. Setting out to make the first hip-hop track of the electronic sounds of Kraftwerk in a time when no hip-hop ever used such electronic sounds, he created the song Planet Walk in 1982, a song that changed everything. This song introduced the West to the TR-808 drum machine, which played the drum pattern from Numbers. And on Synths, we played the riff from Trans-Europe Express. He would also cite YMO as an inspiration for the track, which you can hear on this melodic line. Using the Fairlight CMI, he used a sample that was loaded onto the machine by default called Orc 2, which is an orchestra hit sampled from the classical performance. Stravinsky's Firebird Etude Act 4 from 1910. A sound that was created by all the instruments playing at once for a single hit to shock the audience in the classical piece. That the Fairlight creator added because he thought it was a cool sound, would eventually become extremely popular in hip-hop music in the late 80s, when sampler technology had become more common and orchestra hits would come default on samplers. So much influence can be heard on this one track, and this one track would go on to drastically change the history of two entirely different genres, hip-hop and techno. If hip-hop only relied on funk as a basis and never adopted the electronic sounds that Planet Rock introduced, and especially the 808 drum machine, it could have never innovated, died off as a small fad. Hip-hop songs from then on would use the 808 so much that today, the drum machine is completely associated with hip-hop, the two intertwined on the fundamental level. Even the term boom bap refers to what the 808 kick and 808 snare sound like. Boom bap. So if you want to thank someone for saving hip-hop, thank Kraftwerk. You would hear many electro tracks that use the Numbers break, and this music built around the 808 and the electronica would be called electro. Not to be confused with electro house, a subgenre of house music from the 2000s, or electro clash, a revival of new wave music also from the 2000s. Electro, also known as electro funk or electro boogie, was a style of dance music and hip-hop built around the 808. The music was made by amateur black musicians in the hip-hop scene, taking influence from Kraftwerk and YMO as well as other hip-hop influences such as funk and boogie. The drum patterns on the 808 would typically have syncopated kicks with snares on the 2 and 4, very much like Kraftwerk, as well as laying other 808 percussions on top of them to create many layers of rhythms to make the listener dance. While the hip-hop side of electro would rap over them, the other side of the coin would instead present vocals in a deadpan robotic manner, often with vocoders, emulating the vocal style of Kraftwerk. The synthesizers would emulate some of the more advanced sound designs of Kraftwerk and YMO with cheaper production, with melodies and bass lines also taken from funk music. The music was also typically faster and focused on danceability more so than Kraftwerk and YMO ever were. Subgenres splinting off from electro include Miami bass, which really brought a focus to the 808 kick because unlike wheel kick drums, the 808 kick tapped into even lower sub-bass frequencies that were simply not heard in non-electronic music, especially at the time. And the overpowering bass of Miami bass 808s made the speakers shake and cars vibrate with the power of its kick drum. The 808 kick drum's bass opened up music to a whole new frequency, and everyone wanted a taste of it. Another genre is Latin freestyle, a more pop-accessible version of more conventional singing and lyrics typically about love, but featuring electro drum beats and some Latin music influence from the Latin Americans that perpetuated the music. Electro would really take off in Detroit because of a local radio station segment called the Midnight Funk Association, held by the host called Electrifying Mojo, which ran from 1977 to the mid-80s, where the radio host would play funk, new wave, and electronic music. The music of Kraftwerk and YMO combined with the funk music of groups like James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic become a huge influence on Detroit musicians, where Kraftwerk would become extremely popular in the city. Detroit Electro would develop their own sound, different from the hip-hop of New York, and the artist that we'll focus on is Juan Atkins of Cybertron. Cybertron was formed in 1980 with Juan and Richard Davis with their first single titled Alleys of Your Mind in 1981, which they brought to the Electrifying Mojo to be played on the show. The song is very clearly Juan Atkins trying to do his best Kraftwerk impression of what little he had. This group was making this funky, spacey electronica before Planet Rock and the electro scene in New York, and the music that spawned in Detroit can also be considered different sounds entirely. They released 6 singles and 1 album titled Enter in 1983, a short discography. The song Clear in 1983 would also become a huge hit, and a huge source of sampling because of this effect. The effect itself inspired by a similar effect in Kraftwerk's Hall of Mirrors. The song Techno City in 1984 is possibly an inspiration for the term techno that Juan would use later, although it could have also taken inspiration from the song Technopolis from 1979 off of YMO's Solid State Survivor, a song about Japan's growing power in the electronic and technology industry in the growing 80s. The group would disband due to artistic differences in 1985, and Atkins would create Model 500 to further pursue his own vision. And with Model 500's first track, No UFOs, would be the first ever Detroit techno song. Techno music evolved from electro with a stronger focus on Kraftwerk, as well as pulling from the growing Chicago house scene, as now techno would have a 4-on-the-floor drum pattern with a kick on every strong beat, much like house. But before we talk about techno, we have to talk about house. And before we talk about house, we have to talk about disco. James Brown started his music career as a gospel singer in the 1950s, and then would become a popular rhythm and blues singer, who would ride their success through the 60s until the song Cold Sweat in 1967, which many consider to be the first true funk song. From here, James would change his style to define the sound of funk. These characteristics include a move away from the 2 and 4 being the strongest beats, instead making the 1 the strongest beat, often accenting it with a kick drum, a brass hit, or a shout.
There was that emphasis on boom, God, boom, God, boom, you know, his drum beats.
The drum patterns would have a hard kick on the 1, then fast syncopated snare work through the rest of the bar. The drums were often such an important part that Cold Sweat would be the first of his songs to have a drum break. The drum break is a part of the song where all other instruments cut out and let the drums solo for a bar or two. And most of his songs from here on also feature a drum break. While not always the case, the drum pattern would often follow the structure of a kick on the 1, a strong snare hit on the 2, a snare roll or a snare shuffle on the 3, and a strong snare hit on the 4. The bass lines of his music would reject typical bass line structure and often play melodically. There would only be 1 chord through the whole song, and James wouldn't even sing a melody, instead doing rhythmic shouts riding along the beat, using the voice as another percussive element rather than a melody. Taking inspiration from Black Church, where preachers would often shout for a call and response from the audience, which Brown would also incorporate. He was a very dynamic live performer who hyped up everyone on stage and in the audience with his antics. The 3 elements that make up music, melody, harmony, and rhythm, James Brown's music basically ignored the melody and harmony and was all rhythm. Every instrument became a drum. James had a huge band of players, but he would dictate what each member would play, often vocally mimicking what he hears in his head and telling the players to do that.
He would say things like do 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 do, and it wouldn't really be anything, you know. But a bass player could try to think something like what he do, and he said, no, that's not it. Then they do something else. He said, no, that's that. Then they do say, that's it, that's it. And when he said that's it, you just kept what you were doing.
This limitation on their creativity eventually led to many of the band members to move to other groups, where they could explore their own ideas of a collective. And a strong collective a lot of them moved to was the collective of George Clinton, who had 2 different bands, Parliament and Funkadelic. And while they released different music, both bands had a rotating cast of members and often shared members between each other, as well as both being led by George Clinton, which he jokingly referred to as a Paula Funkadelica meant saying. So the collective was often referred to as Parliament Funkadelic, or P-Funk for short. P-Funk really helped expand and evolve funk, taking inspirations from psychedelic rock and using early synthesizers to evoke a spacey, Afrofuturist mythology through their music, album covers, lyrics, and stage sets and props, which became known as the P-Funk mythology or funkology. This exploration of Afrofuturism showing black people as science fiction space wizards was silly and fun, but was also an uplifting and inspiring message that black people could become anything they aspire to be. They made use of many special effects from distortion and echo pedals that's taken from psychedelic rock, and synthesizers like the Minimoog, which gave keyboardists the ability to pitch bend with the pitch bend wheel of the Minimoog, much like guitarists, and the sound of the Minimoog gave funk basslines a new sound and style to them. While James Brown and George Clinton are big names and pioneers in the funk field, many other acts soon followed, and funk influence building on making people dance above all else would change dance music forever. Disco is often defined by its drum beat, attributed to Earl Young, who played in multiple Philadelphia soul groups in the 1970s and brought his beat with him. This beat is a kick on every corner note, called 4 on the floor, and a snare on the 2 and 4, with syncopated hi-hat rhythms, sometimes doing open hi-hats on the offbeats. Offbeat basically meaning in between each strong beat. These would be played at 120 BPM, or basically 2 kicks a second, which happened to have a hypnotic element to it, replicating the pulse of the heart when dancing. While the drums are extremely straight and on beat, and this made disco very easy to dance and groove to, all over the music was syncopation around the strong beats. Syncopated bass lines influenced by funk would play around the beat, but would also often feature octave jumps to better follow the pattern of the drums, with the bass hitting low notes on the kick and high notes on the open hi-hat. Pulling from Philadelphia soul and classic romantic music would be large orchestral strings and horns to tap into that romantic and uplifting feel, and would often carry the harmony and chords, as well as having uplifting vocals influenced by soul. The music would also feature heavy Latin influence, with uniquely Latin percussive instruments and Latin rhythms such as the rumba, samba, cha-cha-cha, and most importantly the clave rhythm. The clave rhythm is one of the oldest and most important rhythms that laid the background for many Latin genres of either the 3-2 clave or the 2-3 clave. Either way you play it, it will feature a tresillo, which is 3 dotted eighth notes, and Latin music will often loop the tresillo rhythm as well. You will hear this rhythm all throughout soul and funk music, but especially in disco and throughout electronic dance music as well. A huge factor of disco is the DJ, who found disco played really well at parties because of how easy they were to dance to with a simple drum beat at 120 BPM. And when every song has the same drum beat at the same tempo, it becomes a lot easier to more seamlessly transition from song to song on the DJ set, allowing them to have a non-stop hour-long mix of simple, easy-to-dance to music. And if you have everyone dancing to a disco groove, why would you change to a different drum beat and throw off that groove? While the music had minor success on the radio, it was really the dance clubs where disco grew. And the reason why disco clubs grew was because of the Stonewall riots in 1969, where the police raided the gay bar and a riot started, leading to weeks of protests by the LGBT community. And to mark the anniversary a year later was the first gay pride parade in 1970. Through their efforts, police finally became more lax on the law that same-sex partners couldn't dance together, and gay dance clubs exploded and became where everyone wanted to be. More gay people who had previously avoided gay clubs out of fear of police could finally meet each other without fear. Women could go there without fear of getting hit on, and other marginalized groups such as Black, Latino, and other immigrant communities soon joined these clubs as a place to escape from the discrimination they could face in more popular clubs, and everyone could finally let loose and have some fun. And the music that they played was disco. The clubs had become more elaborate, with light shows, disco balls, crazy fashion and dance competitions. Turns out the gays really knew how to party. This was still an underground craze for most of the 70s, and won't blow up into the mainstream until Saturday Night Fever, a movie from 1977 dedicated to this unique subculture in the music of disco. After this movie, disco would become the mainstream. Disco Fever led to what many considered a lot of watered down music that wasn't authentic, with the only similarity being Earl Young's drum beat. And while that was important to the music, they would lose a lot of the other elements that made the music great, with many records just slapping disco on the cover as it would get way more sales. Bands that previously didn't make disco started to make it to cash in, including many funk acts and even rock and roll acts like Kiss had a disco album. There'll be disco cover albums of everything, even movie soundtracks like the Star Wars and Other Galactic Funk album, which made disco versions of songs from the movie soundtrack in 1977. There was Hooked on the Classics, an album that took existing classical songs and changed nothing about it except adding a drummer who played the disco beat. There was so much discount disco that you couldn't spell discount without disco. That's how bad it was. The disco fever would last from 1977 to 1979, but on July 12, 1979 was Disco Demolition Night.
They got a chant here. I don't want to turn it down.
While the frustration from rock fans who were tired of hearing watered-down music over the exact same drum beat non-stop is understandable, it's clear that this event was expressing racism and homophobia toward what disco was attributed to, marginalized ethnic and gay communities.
First thing I have against it is that I can never find a white three-piece suit that fits me off the rack. So I hate the taste of pina coladas. I'm allergic to gold jewelry, so there's nothing there for me.
This event brought way more people than expected and led to a riot, and the aftermath of the event led to a growing nationwide hatred of disco. Record labels soon labeled disco acts not as disco records, but dance records instead, as disco became a dirty word. NBC journalist Mark Anderson writes, "The chance to yell 'disco sucks' meant more than simply a musical style choice. It was a chance to push back on a whole set of social dynamics that lay just beneath the surface of a minor battle between a DJ and a radio station. More importantly, it was a chance for a whole lot of people to say that they didn't like the way that the world was changing around them, or who they saw as the potential victors in the cultural and demographic war." While disco would slowly die in America and not be heard throughout the early 80s, it would live on in Europe with Eurodisco. And to understand that, we had to talk about Giorgio Moroder. Giorgio Moroder worked as a sound designer and music producer for other musicians throughout the 60s, and gained enough success that in the 70s he created Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany, where he resided at the time, and his own record label, Oasis Records, which would eventually become a subdivision of a bigger American label, Casablanca Records. He would help produce records for many musicians throughout his career, with his early records he released under his own name being bubblegum pop and psychedelic rock in the early 70s. In 75, he would release Einzelgänger, an experimental electronic album that gave this pop musician the chance to explore the new and exciting sounds electronic music can create, taking some influence from electronic krautrock of the early 70s, including Kraftwerk. It was at this point that disco was reaching more popularity, and Giorgio would produce and co-write for disco musician Donna Summers, and release some hits together, with her fifth album in 1977 being titled I Remember Yesterday, a concept album that would take the sound of disco and combine it with the sounds of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It only made sense that the last song of the album would explore what the music of the future would sound like, and so Giorgio used the Moog synthesizer to generate the iconic arpeggiated bass line. The bass was given a delay effect, which effectively doubled the speed of it, and gave it a rolling or galloping feel that the dance floor loved. With a futuristic pad added as well, everything about the song was electronic except for a single 4-on-the-floor kick drum and the vocals, which made up one of the most important single songs in its entire history. The song exposed a mainstream pop audience to a sound that was unheard of in 1977. Brian Eno and David Bowie working together in Berlin on the Berlin Trilogy when they heard it on the radio, and Eno told Bowie to stop what he was doing and listen. This is it, look no further. This single is going to change the sound of club music for the next 15 years. And he was right, only vastly underestimating the timescale. While Donna's music continued in the more traditional disco style, Moroder explored a fully electronic disco in his own albums, From Here to Eternity in 1977 and E=MC² in 79, both of which would reach great success. When asked to compose for a chase song for the movie Midnight Express in 78, he was asked to do something along the lines of I Feel Love, something simple but memorable, so he composed the song Chase. Once again bringing back the Moog bass line, which I'll refer to as the Moroder bass, underlining it with a disco beat and playing a Kraftwerk-esque melody on top, with a bittersweet and melancholic sound. This song would influence the sound of future science fiction film music, being a clear example of proto-synthwave. Kraftwerk's Man Machine, which came out the same year, features the song Metropolis, also evoking similar feelings of a future dystopia and a similar bass line. While Giorgio would move on from this kind of sound and go back to producing other types of music for movies and other musicians throughout the 80s and 90s that were more pop accessible for the time, many artists would start to make the type of electronic disco that Giorgio did throughout the late 70s. When asked in an interview why so many people loved Donna Summer's I Feel Love, she said it had a high energy vibe. This would become the title for the genre of higher tempo electronic disco following the song's success, stylized as HI-NRG. Emulating the style of I Feel Love, High Energy was typically less funk influenced and played the beats a lot more straight, with marauder bass lines or octave jumping bass lines that were synthesized. Over time, this would evolve into bass lines that did octave jump but have more rhythmic variation, maybe hitting a top note twice before returning to the bottom note, or being in a different rhythm entirely. You can definitely hear this in the song You Spin Me Right Round. The reason octave jumping bass lines became so ubiquitous was High Energy often ditched the open hi-hat on the offbeat that you would hear in disco, so the bass had to replace that, as well as the fact that programming a synthesizer to automatically jump octaves while you held a note was very easy to do. The BPM was usually between 120 and 140 BPM with an average of 127. The big development of its sound would be the Linn LM1, a drum machine from 1980 that had a digital samples, however it was much more expensive and was used by big studio musicians rather than amateurs with low production budget like those in electro and hip-hop who would use the 808 instead. Future sample-based drum machines like the Oberheim DMX in 1980 and the successor Linn Drum in 1982, which was cheaper and more popular, disco could finally become fully electronic, as before they would be making electronic music with live drummers being the last acoustic element of the band. Before this point, disco required many session musicians to do horns, strings, guitars, and other instrumental elements. But with everything becoming electronic, you could do the same with a much smaller crew and for much cheaper, allowing lots of music to be pumped out quickly. While High Energy didn't hit American airwaves, it would become big in Europe, and specifically the gay scene in San Francisco, thanks to San Fran-based producer Patrick Calvi, and the genre became associated with divas and drag queens who would often play the music during their shows. With the Linn Drum and similar drum machines, you can easily keep the disco beat of a kick on every strong beat and a snare on the 2 and 4 at any tempo you wanted. But you could also start to see a large use of claps and cowbell in the percussion. Lots of cowbell. The strings and horns were replaced by synth pads and synth brass. The lyrics were typically very cheesy and uplifting, much like disco. A sister genre evolving from this sound is Italo disco, which was of a slower BPM and typically more experimental and focused on creating interesting sound design, not limiting itself completely to the cheesy, happy sound disco, while still maintaining the drum beat and bass lines. It would lean more into the craftwork side of things, with vocoders and talk about technology and machines in the lyrics. Disco was still popular in Italy, the home country of Giorgio Moroder, and as disco stopped being produced in America, they ended up making their own. This music was typically in English instead of Italian, as it was the common second language of Italians and the world at large, giving it a more international appeal, as well as the fact that English is much easier to rhyme with. The line between High Energy and Italo disco is definitely blurry. Some Italo disco songs can definitely pass as High Energy, and the genre overall has a bigger variety, while High Energy is a lot more specific and uniform in its sound. Nowadays they're often grouped together and both called High Energy or both called Italo disco or both referred to under the umbrella term of Eurodisco. The only big High Energy hit to penetrate the American radio is You Spin Me Right Round by Dead or Alive in 1984. However, even then, Americans just called it synthpop or new wave, unaware of how big High Energy was in Europe and in Japan. In Japan specifically, all Eurodisco imports, both Italo and High Energy, were both given the label of Eurobeat, and burst the power dance and the surrounding subculture, where people would do synchronized dances to Eurobeat music, typically having a unique and specific dance routine for each song. To give you an idea of how big it was in Japan, Michael Jackson had trouble securing a concert spot in Japan because Dead or Alive was performing there. While High Energy and Italo disco were fading out of popularity in Europe by the transition into the 90s and would evolve into Eurodance, to tap into and revive the Japanese market, a compilation album called Super Eurobeat would be released in 1990 and be extremely successful. The first dozen or so volumes of this popular compilation series would feature more traditional High Energy sounds. But over the years, this music evolved to go even faster, from 140 BPM to tempos of up to 180 BPM, making Super Eurobeat some of the fastest dance music around at the time. They would also soon focus on a specific style of superstar synths, especially this synth brass that was used for a lot of the melodies at the time. The synth brass would typically do very fast climbs and ascends down a scale that would come off more like sound effects than a melody at times. All the songs on the compilation series were soon composed solely for this series and not released anywhere else by a small group of artists, featuring Italian artists singing in English for a solely Japanese audience. The music would receive another huge boom in popularity in 1998 because of two new sources of media using it heavily. The anime series Initial D, which heavily featured the music and is where most Westerners are exposed to it, and nowadays is completely referred to as racing music or car music because of its association in the West. The other source is Rhythm Games. Dance Dance Revolution came out in 1998, and while it featured other popular music in Japan, it would use Super Eurobeat and its later and more difficult levels due to its speed, and become a staple genre of music to be featured in all Japanese rhythm games to come, including a game called Power Power Paradise, dedicated to the Para Para culture.
What you're seeing on screen is called Para dancing, and it's actually a popular form of dance in Japan. In 2000, game maker Konami cashed in on the craze and released an arcade game named Para Paradise, which used motion sensors to judge players' dance moves. Arcades started importing them into America, much to the delight of skinny, pasty-faced geeks nationwide.
Because of anime, rhythm games, and the Para Para dance culture, Super Eurobeat would last a long time as an underground genre, with the Super Eurobeat compilation series lasting 250 volumes from 1990 to 2018, making it the longest running compilation series of all time. Other Japanese companies would make Eurobeat as well, such as, amusingly, a series of Eurobeat Disney releases in 2000 and 2001, and you would have Disney performers doing Power Power dances to the Mickey Mouse Club March Eurobeat version in Japan at the time. The dances specifically would influence the song-specific choreographed dances seen in a lot of Asian pop idol groups from the 90s onwards. Not to mention both Eurobeat and Eurodance heavily influencing the sound of J-pop idol music and later on K-pop. With the constant popularity of rock music in mainstream America, as well as the small, usually 4-man band needed to make it, with a lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass guitar, and drum kit, compared to other styles of music, it allowed many amateur bands to form in the 60s once electronic guitars and related equipment were finally affordable, producing local hits that could sometimes reach wider success, but was typically with simple and amateur music with cheap production and sound, referred to as garage rock, as they were often performed in garages. Though this amateur, simpler sound would grow into a proto-punk sound, eventually coming to a style of music called punk rock, or just punk, in the mid-70s. This music was typically fast-paced and simple, focused on being fun and energetic, such as the defining punk rock hit Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones in 1976. To quote Ramones drummer Tommy Ramone, in its initial form, a lot of 1960s stuff was innovative and exciting. Unfortunately, what happens is that people who could not hold a candle to the likes of Hendrix started noodling away. Soon you had endless solos that went nowhere. By 1973, I knew that what we needed was some pure, stripped down, no bullshit rock and roll. With the philosophy of rebellion came the philosophy of DIY, do it yourself, encouraging independent artists and independent labels to form. A lot of these musicians would embrace the sloppiness and unconventional song structure, as well as creating interesting soundscapes to distortion. Punk rock would help evolve numerous subgenres of rock, such as alternative rock, grunge, post-rock, indie rock, but the main one we'll be focusing on is post-punk, which came about in the late 70s to move away from the raw, fast, and aggressive punk for more experimental and avant-garde sounds, typically focusing on heavy distortion to create more ambient music. A subgenre of post-punk is Gothic rock, with the first Gothic rock record being Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus in 1979, exploring eerie and minimal soundscapes through heavy guitar distortion to evoke the feelings of Dracula. The group that we will be focusing on today is Joy Division, named after the sexual slavery ring of a Nazi concentration camp mentioned in the 1955 novel House of Dolls. They released the most seminal album titled Unknown Pleasures in 1979, a very dark, distorted, and depressing record that is held as a classic by many. Among rock influences, the band also quotes New, the krautrock group, David Bowie and Brian Eno's Berlin Trilogy, which itself was made in Germany and heavily inspired by krautrock, laying the foundation for many post-punk and post-rock afterward, and Kraftwerk. The group was inspired by Kraftwerk's, quote, marriage between humans and machines, and they played Trans-Europe Express throughout the PA system before they went on stage, to get a momentum. Lead singer and lyricist Ian Curtis tragically committed suicide in 1980, and the band, having agreed to change their name if a member left, reorganized into New Order, where they moved away from the dark and depressing tone led by their late friend after their first album titled Movement in 1981, which explored similar themes as Joy Division but with more synthesizers. After the first album, they explored the New York club scene, where they heard post-disco music as well as freestyle and electro music as they came out in 82 and 83, not to mention Italo Disco. In 83, they would release the album titled Power, Corruption, and Lies, where they found their new sound, mixing distorted guitars with synthesizers for pads and harmony. The big hit from the album is Blue Monday, a song that took strong inspiration from Kraftwerk and Giorgio Moroder. The kick pattern, inspired by Donna Summer's Our Love from 1979, produced by Moroder, and that Blue Monday played in the Oberheim DX drum machine. The synth bass played an octave-jumping bass line much in the style of Italo disco, but also featured a bass player playing small melodic lines intermittently, giving a song that has a completely electronic, otherwise a strong rock vibe. Not to mention the bass guitar line is inspired by a western. The song directly sampled the Kraftwerk song Uranium from Radioactivity, where the Monk chorus was loaded onto an EMU emulator, a digital sampler that went for $10,000 in 1981, but went down to only $2,000 in 1983, making it a very early choice for digital sampling for being the most affordable one at the time. The song would lay the foundation for the rest of New Order's music, as well as for a lot of new wave music. New wave is a very broad umbrella term for many pop rock acts in the late 70s and 80s that introduced synthesizers into the rock set. This was the point where portable synthesizers were finally affordable enough that keyboardists could join a rock band and provide new sounds for them, giving these do-it-yourself punk-influenced groups an edge over non-synthesized competitors. While post-punk was a darker, gothic, and more experimental sound, new wave is its lighter, more pop counterpart, evolving from punk rock but taking a lighter and in some cases more bubblegum pop perspective. Examples of late 70s, early 80s new wave include New Order, Blondie, Talking Heads, Devo, and the B-52s. Some of these groups, like the B-52s and Devo, really leaned into the sense of silliness and just having fun. But the B-52s having a lead singer that has an almost cartoonish voice delivery, singing about rock lobsters and private Idahos. And Devo, the song being short for De-Evolution, exploring surrealist humor and satire and demonstrating very silly fashion. A lot of the punk scene, which is very serious in its vocal scenes of rebellion, hated these groups. But if you think about it, these guys are being more unique, more rebellious, and more punk than them, by sticking to their unique sensibilities no matter how much they were bullied for it. Some publications, specifically American ones, would use the term new wave very broadly to describe any pop music with a synth sound, even if it didn't follow the lineage of punk rock or any rock instrumentals. Synth pop, on the other hand, has a much more clear umbrella term, as just any pop music with a strong electronic element. What we are going to focus on now is late 70s, early 80s UK synth pop, once again taking influence from Kraftwerk, Krautrock, David Bowie, as well as Giorgio Moroder's I Feel Love, become British acts like Daniel Miller, who under the name The Normal, self-released TVOD and Warm Lazarette on a single record in 1978. Because he left his address on the record, he got many demo tapes sent to him from people who wanted to make similar, simple, harsh, and addicting electronica, which led to him to create Mute Records, which would eventually be the record label for groups like DIF, New Order, and Depeche Mode. Needless to say that his big hit Warm Lazarette would be an important launch point of many other synth acts. The song itself inspired by the book Crash, which is about people sexually aroused by car crashes, and exploring more of that sexuality that a lot of these synth pop acts would do. There was Ultravox, who worked with Krautrock producer and engineer Connie Plank on the album System of Romance in 1978 and Vienna in 1980, Connie Plank having previously worked with New and early Kraftwerk and Autobahn. Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, or OMD for short, which hit big with the track Electricity in 1979, which itself was a reinterpretation of the song Radioactivity from Kraftwerk. Gary Newman with his tracks Our Friends Electric and Cars in 1979, which become the biggest synth pop hits so far, while the others were a bit more underground. The Human League, whose early works in the 1970s were more abrasive like the other groups I mentioned here, would eventually reinvent themselves in the 1980s. The two schoolgirls as singers, and finally hit it big with the track Don't You Want Me in 1981. Soft Cell, whose hit Tainted Love is actually a cover of a 1964 soul song of the same name, which became an underground hit over the years as a deep cut for DJs in the 70s, but never saw big success when it came out in the 60s. Just because their most famous song is a cover, doesn't mean that their original songs stray far from the 70s UK synth-pop sound, though. And of course, Depeche Mode. His first album in 1981 was very bubblegum pop, and they were even considered a teen pop band, but through the 80s would go for a darker and more industrial feel, using lead singer Dave Gahan's unique and strong voice to explore similar ideas to Kraftwerk. Later on, they would develop more traditional new wave sound by the late 80s, bringing a bigger focus on guitars mixed with synthesizers. The album Violator in 1990 featured the songs Personal Jesus, evoking the idea of Americana and westerns, and Enjoy the Silence, focusing on the more New Order sounds, with its use of synthesizers and guitars together. My dream is to combine the emotion of Neil Young or John Lennon, transmitted by Kraftwerk synthesizers, soul music played by electronic instruments. A lot of these groups were also part of New Romanticism, a cultural movement in the UK between 1979 and 1984. Inspired by glam rock acts such as David Bowie and Roxy Music, people wore clothing inspired by past fashion trends, putting on androgynous makeup, and explored the subject of sexual taboo a lot. These influences, combined with the experimental sound of synthesizers, gave a lot of early UK synth pop that distinct style in their singing, lyricism, and fashion. While I won't spend a lot of time naming every single big synth pop hit throughout the 80s, as most of you probably hear them endlessly anyway, a lot of the music was built off of the foundation that the British laid down. So I felt it was important to cover that early history to give a better appreciation for how all the classic mid to late 80s hits got their sound. However, what I do want to talk about is New Wave's revival genre in the 2000s, Electroclash. While pop music in the 90s was dominated by hip-hop, R&B, and alternative rock, moving the synth-pop sound altogether from the airwaves, many acts in New York and in Europe wanted to bring back the new wave and synth-pop ideals of do-it-yourself amateurism, as well as some of the new romantic fashion, but with more modern production techniques and inspiration from 90s electronic music like techno. Acts like Misskit and the Hacker, Ladytron, Scissor Sisters, Fisher Spooner, Le Tigre, Vitalik, Chicks on Speed, and Crystal Castles, who later on would help develop the sound of Witch House, which has nothing to do with house music, but is instead inspired more by chopped and screwed hip-hop, shoegaze, 80s synth-pop melodies, re-spaces, reverse vocals, and other occult themes. These Electroclash grooves took influences like New Order's Blue Monday, new wave like B-52s and Devo, which you can hear in acts like Le Tigre, and surprisingly old 80s 8-bit video games. The music built off of old chiptune sounds from 8-bit systems like the Commodore 64, Atari, NES, and Game Boy, but also demo scene music, heard from tracker music like that of the Amiga, which I'll cover more in depth later. The music built off of that chiptune sound would be called Bitpop. Some of the earliest proto-Bitpop might be Yellow Magic Orchestra, with their use of chiptune and arcade sampling in the late 70s, but is exemplified in Electroclash with IF and their hit Space Invaders of Smoking Grass, and Crystal Castle's first self-titled album, which sampled demo scene chiptune and arcade sounds. These stripped-down amateur electronic acts really throw back to early UK synth-pop, with a song like TVOD sound like it could have been made by Crystal Castles. Before I move on to finally talking about house music, I want to make a short detour to talk about synthwave, and how it's supposedly built off the idea of what the 80s sound like. While synthwave definitely takes inspiration from Giorgio Moroder in his bass line, which can be heard all over the music, and is drawn from the most proto-synthwave song of them all, Giorgio Moroder's Chase, is more inspired by movie soundtracks, such as those of Blade Runner, and soundtracks by John Hammer, who composed the music for Miami Vice, as well as some of the more ambient artists like Jean-Michel Jarre, with the song Oxygen Part 4 in 1977, and Tangerine Dream, especially the song Love on the Wheel Train from the movie Risky Business in 1983. Much like the film soundtracks they are inspired by, synthwave is typically pretty sparse with a rolling Moroder bass, a disco drum beat with some tom fills but at a lower BPM than 120, closer to 100 BPM, simple repetitive melodies that often arpeggiate the chord progressions played on the squelching synth strings from 80s synthesizers like the Juno 106 and DX7. As much of these songs are based on essentially background music from the films they are from, they are more for passive listening than dancing. Subgenres like dark synths are inspired more by horror films, such as the soundtracks by John Carpenter. A lot of the early synthwave groups were also inspired by and a part of French house and electro house scenes, drawing influence from the production techniques of a lot of the quintessential modern synthwave songs coming from the movie Drive from 2011. The song Home Resonance specifically plays a short 3-note melodic idea with straight eighth notes and then repeats it with added 16 notes in between to add rhythmic interest. A similar melodic technique can be heard in a lot of high-energy and Italo-disco songs in the late 70s and early 80s, such as the song Visitors by Koto, and even Popcorn. But typically the melodies in synthwave are just arpeggiating the chord progressions. And now, back to the death of disco. In America, disco went into the underground, and one place that it stayed alive in was the Chicago club called The Warehouse. DJ Frankie Knuckles bought dance records from all kinds of genres, including imported Eurodisco records, a rarity at the time. Chicago record stores would label records with the phrase, "as played at the Warehouse," which became shortened to house music. As DJ equipment wasn't advanced enough at the time, Frankie would have to re-edit and remix songs on a reel-to-reel tape machine, editing disco, funk, soul, and similar genres into specific mixes that removed all the fluff and just played the most danceable part of the song on loop.
Playing music like some of the Blondie tunes and the B-52s.
Rock Lobster. And when they did the part where it said down, 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 everybody went down on the ground.
We'd come out of craft work and go into, One Nation Under a Groove.
So it was like a really weird time for music because you had all these black kids dancing to punk music.
Being a gay man himself, he initially drew crowds of mostly gay black men, but soon his innovative DJing and mixes attracted all kinds of people. Gifted to him by Derek May, a key figure in the Detroit techno scene, was the most important drum machine to house and techno music. While hip-hop had the 808, the drum machine that defined the electronic dance scene is the TR-909, the successor to the 808 from 1983 for more realistic drum synthesis and even some samples for its crash, ride, and hi-hats. While the 808 kick was boomy with its heavy sub-bass, the 909 kick was punchy, and Frankie Knuckles would add his own TR-909 percussion to his mixes and even live performances, adding the 4-on-the-floor kick of the 909 that made crowds go wild, as well as other percussion rhythms with snares, claps, and hi-hats. They thought that the 909 clap sounded like it was saying "jack," leading to a bit of a cultural meme, and a dance called jacking, which is basically humping the air with your whole body to the beat. You would hear the term used a lot in early house songs such as "Time to Jack" and "Jack Your Body." The first house record is by fellow Chicago house DJ Jesse Saunders, sampling the bass line from the novelty space disco hit Space Invaders, adding lots of 909 percussion on top of it, making the song On and On in 1984. Jesse Saunders and Larry Sherman co-founded Trax Records later that year, which would become the record label for 80s Chicago house music. Soon many DJs were making their own house tracks, but with money and technology limitations, these songs were almost always made with a drum machine and 1 or 2 synthesizers, often looping a single melody and bass line while pulling in and out percussion elements from an 808 or 909 or other drum machine. Due to sample limitations, they would often record a single line into a synth and then play it over and over rhythmically, restarting the line and using it as if it was another percussive element.
Now I'm going to talk into the sampler right here. Work your body. And then we can play it from the keyboard. It stays into the sampler and I can play it on the keyboard up and down the scale. Work your body, work your body. You can have a fast or a slow effect. Like the Chipmunks, or real. Then I'll bring in the percussion, high congas, low congas.
So now with the bass line or drum beat set, the rhythm in place, and the vocal all recorded, Farley and Sweet D are ready to make what in the record business is known as a demo.
Work your body, work your body, work your body.
These were amateur musicians with no training, but that also meant that they weren't limited to conventions. Their goal was just to make a catchy loop and bring musical elements in and out of the mix for variation. The 1986 song that really put Chicago house music on the map is Marshall Jefferson's Move Your Body. Notably, Trax owner Larry Sherman did not like the song, saying that it was not house music. Marshall then named the song House Music Anthem and brought it to all the house clubs where it became an instant hit, one DJ playing it on loop 6 times in a row on the first day. At that point, he had no choice but to release the song on Trax Records. Not being a professional keyboard player, he actually inputted the notes into the Prophet 2000 a lot slower, at around 40 BPM and then sped it up, 40 BPM being about 1/3 of the speed of the final 120 BPM track. The piano chords themselves were just a primary triad, the 1 chord, 4 chord, and 5 chord. Very simple, but that's all you need. House music didn't really have chords because, again, limitations, by only being able to use 1 or 2 synthesizers. By playing piano chords with such rhythmic syncopation, you can have harmony without sacrificing a danceable rhythm from the lack of a melody. It's more born out of necessity than anything else. With these new piano chord rhythms now an option in house music would come the song Strings of Life by Derek May, the Detroit techno producer. It's based on the piano sequence by his friend Michael James, who played the song he was working on into Derek's synthesizer, which recorded it into memory. Derek found it later and then sped it up and chopped it up into loops, adding 909 percussion and string samples. When it finally hit the UK in 1988, it was the rave anthem. The method of piano playing with the bass note leading into the chords in a very off-the-grid manner would become ubiquitous and constantly emulated in future piano house tracks. Mr. Fingers was developing his own style of house music, which would become the subgenre of deep house, the big hit from him being Can You Feel It? Introducing more complex minor seventh chords and exploring more complex and soulful feelings than the ecstatic, happy dance sounds of traditional house, with a focus on deep bass lines and jazzy chords. Another subgenre of house would come from the TB-303, a poor bass emulation synth that just so happened to have a lot of knobs on the top for manipulation of synthesis parameters such as cutoff frequency, resonance, envelope modulation, and decay. The first acid house song was Acid Tracks by Future in 1987. The very unconventional step sequencing of the machine led to a very unusual bass line, just by virtue of it being difficult to program. With note second slide and accent, amateurs often programming it in chromatic and dissonant patterns, which add to the charm. The fact it can only fill one bar at a time led to acid house becoming very repetitive, but the ever-evolving sound design that came from messing with the synthesizer helped to make it interesting even with its limited pattern size. What else could you call the sound but acid?
This here is called a Roland TB-303 bass line. Me and Spanky in a group called Future, we picked this up at a secondhand shop for 40 bucks. And this was basically designed to emulate a bass guitar. And it did a real crappy job of it. But I realized that, yo, I could make this bass sound do like some weird stuff. So I was like, I'm gonna just twist these knobs in a crazy way because I like warping that sound. And I was like, all right, let me start twisting the knobs. And then it was like jamming like this. And we just, yeah, keep doing it. He said, Pierre, keep doing it. So I was like, okay, I'm turning the knobs. And then we thought it sounded real crazy. And then I started turning it like this. And then we was like, oh, that's it right there, that's it.
This psychedelic sound opened up the genre to more psychedelic and dark themes than often heard in dance music, such as in the song Where Is Your Child? Tapping into house's soulful inspirations would be songs like Love Can't Turn Around, which would become the first house record to hit the UK singles chart, as well as the song Promised Land, a deep house track with synth strings and uplifting religious vocals calling back to classic soul. These songs would exemplify how much Chicago house has evolved in just 3 years, from 1984 to 1987. It was a hotbed for innovation by amateurs who just loved dance music. While mainstream America wasn't ready for it, as it was still underground in the cities of Chicago, Detroit, and New York, it blew up in the UK as soon as it arrived. Many house songs becoming Billboard charting hits, which would never happen in America.
They started playing house music at this Michigan Avenue hotel and health club last summer, and they've been packing them in ever since. It's the first time house has escaped the Southside dance clubs or Northside juice bars for a more upscale audience, though it's still a long way from sweeping the city. But in London, house has made it to the top of the pops faster than anything since the Beatles. All right, listen, we got a new number one. You tell them about it. Steve Silk-Hurley.
In the UK, it was all called acid house, even if it didn't use the 303 acid bass line, though it often did. Starting what is called the Second Summer of Love, lasting from 1988 to 1989 in the UK, with a huge rise in unlicensed parties which were cracked down upon by British law enforcement, leading to secret venues and warehouses and other places, which created what we now call raves. With the underground raves came drugs, ecstasy being the drug of choice at the time, leading to ravers to be called the chemical generation, with how much drugs were associated with these raves by negative press. The symbol of acid house became the smiley face, and needless to say, it created a movement in the country. But we have to step back for a bit, and go back to Detroit and Twan Atkins in the early 80s. While his style of music evolved to take influence from house music and his transition to Detroit techno and the name Model 500, It was still very electro-sounding, much like his earlier work. However, he had a small group of friends which become known as the Bell Bell Three, credited for inventing Detroit techno. The three were Juan Atkins, the originator, Derek May, the innovator, and Kevin Saunderson, the elevator.
Kraftwerk did an interview about their tour because they're doing a U.S. tour. And they put in the interview, yeah, we're coming to Detroit. You know, we want to get with our friends and do after hours. So I'm thinking, well, who are their friends in Detroit? You know, couldn't be nobody but myself, Derek, and Kevin.
While Juan's work was unmistakable and very influential at the point, the person we need to look at to understand what makes techno what it is today is Derek May, who went under the name Rhythm is Wisdom. Derek's sound had a larger focus on utilizing the 909 to its fullest potential, with constantly evolving snares, hi-hats, toms, rides, scratches, rim shots, all with the 4-on-the-floor kick drum, keeping all the percussive complexity grounded. With the constantly changing 909 patterns that evolved with the song would also come soulful synth strings for harmony, Juan never really working of chords or harmony in his music. It can be considered slower than Atkins' work, but it brought a deeper percussive and harmonic element to it, sounding very robotic and mechanical, but trying to find that soul in the machine. If you have trouble understanding the difference between house and techno, think of it like this. House music follows the lineage of disco, Giorgio Moroder, and Yo disco. It's more about soulful and uplifting vocals and chord progressions and the philosophies of disco, while techno more directly follows the lineage of Kraftwerk and electro. It's more about exploring the scenes of technology and decay through repetition and variation, and trying to find a soul in the very unsoulful elements of electronica, unlike house. They're two sides of the same coin, light and dark, yin and yang. Even Derek's house anthem, Strings of Life, still has a very mechanical element to it. Kevin Saunderson is called the Elevator because he helped bring techno to the mainstream with his project Inner City, with female vocalist Paris Grey, who would make huge hits in the house scene. Retroactively, we can clearly say that this is house music and not techno. However, techno was still finding itself at the time, and the lines weren't so clear, as shown with Strings of Life. However, Kevin's other work outside of Inner City are a lot more techno. For example, the track Just Want Another Chance under his alias Reese. This track is now very important as it's the originator of this bass sound, which is now called the Reese bass, named after him. The Reese bass would become big in other genres of music like jungle and drum and bass, but can be heard in many genres like UK garage, dubstep, and other sound design focused genres. The work of these three would be considered the first wave of Detroit techno, and a lot of the themes and sounds of their work is attributed to the inner city decay of Detroit, a city that was once the forefront of progress and now in ruins. The city becomes a character itself, explored through the music. With a huge and sudden rise of rave music in the UK, so came compilations of Detroit techno to the scene, with the UK developing their own genre of techno called bleep techno or Yorkshire bass, fusing elements of acid house of techno and electro with a larger focus on heavy sub-bass inspired by reggae sound system culture, which we'll cover in the next chapter. With a demand for more electronic music in the UK and the fact that techno has a much smaller and more clear sense of origination with these three pioneers, and journalists are the ones who gave them the title of the Bell Bell Three, the three helped to develop the UK compilation release called Techno, the new dance sound of Detroit, along with the UK DJ and Cool Cat Records boss Neil Rushton. The compilation becoming a hit in the UK and bringing the name techno into public consciousness. Another British label, ZTT Records, wanted them to form a techno supergroup with them, called Intellects. But the plan fell through, with Derek refusing the demands in the contract. ZTT boss Trevor Horn envisioned that the trio would be marketed as, quote, the Black Pet Shop Boys. With the three getting all this attention from across the Atlantic, leading to the second wave of Detroit techno in the 90s following their absence. The techno collective called Underground Resistance was formed, made up of members like Carl Craig, Jeff Mills, Robert Hood, and Mike Banks, who was previously a bassist for Parliament Funkadelic. The early releases include some very lo-fi techno, acid, and electro, with Jeff Mills having previous experience working with industrial and EBM sounds, which he brought into techno. Jeff Mills and Robert Hood would leave the group in 1992 to pursue and achieve great international success, leaving Mike Banks to pursue more funky and uplifting techno, such as their releases under the name Galaxy to Galaxy in 1993, with tracks like High Tech Jazz. Merging the funky and uplifting nature of Mike's previous work of P-Funk with modern techno production and philosophy. Another big element of the second wave is the highly underrated Drexciya, made up of Gerald Donald and James Stinson. Drexciya shrouded themselves in mystery and mythology, with the name being a title for an advanced underwater civilization they explored through their music. In the mythology, Drexcians are descendants of pregnant slaves, thrown overboard on the way to America centuries ago, and the children born from these slaves could live underwater and formed a race of beings, the Drexians, which became far more advanced than any race on Earth. The music used the TR-808 and electro conventions to explore the aquatic narrative, blurring the lines between electro and techno. One half of Drexciya, Gerald Donald, would form Doppler Effect and explore more of this electro-techno fusion in the late 90s and can be heard on this compilation album. After this, in the 2000s, they would explore more ambient, abstract, and industrial soundscapes. James Stinson, the other half of Drexciya and creator of the mythology, would release Lifestyles of the Laptop Cafe under the alias of The Other People Place in 2001, before tragically passing away the next year from heart complications. The album now seen as a techno classic in retrospect, exploring themes of loneliness through a more warm and down-tempo mood than normally explored in techno. Before we talk about Wave's evolution of house and techno throughout Europe in the 90s, we need to understand the symbiotic relationship between electronic dance music and hip-hop. And to understand that, we have to go back, way back, to the invention of hip-hop. Kingston, Jamaica, 1940s. Buying new records was an expensive investment for the average Jamaican that they couldn't afford, and the only way to hear new music was through the sound systems. DJs would load up a truck of huge sound systems and DJ equipment and drive into neighborhoods blasting the music and setting up street parties. They would play American rhythm and blues in the beginning, but as Jamaican music culture progressed, they would play ska, rocksteady, and reggae, as British establishment radios refused to play the people's music, so it was the only way to hear it. In the late 50s, the systems became more custom-built, more loud, more bassy. There would be competitions between sound systems, each one having a DJ, called the selector, who chose the songs, and an MC, the master of ceremonies, who hosted the events and were the ones to speak into the microphone. MCs would soon toast over the songs. A mix of talking and chanting originated from African oral tradition, to hype up the crowds, mixing jokes and commentaries of rhythmic chants not too different from a lot of radio hosts. Records would come with a B-side that was just the instrumental version of the song without vocals, and people would get on the microphone and improvise their own lyrics, called freestyling. There would be sound clashes, battles between different sound systems to see who would win the favor of the crowd, where the challenge was not only for the selector to collect and play the best underground tracks, but some sound systems paying artists to secure exclusive use of their songs, but the MC had to also humiliate the other sound system with the toast over the music with comedy and braggadocious lyrics, the origin of the rap battle. And with these giant powerful sound systems, music engineers would soon emphasize the bass in their mixing, as well as applying effects like echo and reverb to take full advantage of and show off the sound system's capabilities and wow the audience, developing the style known as dub. Dub was basically sound system specific edits of reggae songs without vocals and emphasizing these effects. Dub would heavily influence many genres of music with its effects, eventually evolving into many deep, bassy subgenres of electronic music. DJ Kool Herc, a Jamaican-born immigrant in the Bronx, wanted to bring this sound clash culture from Jamaica to New York. He played the dance music of the time, funk, and noticed that the crowds at his shows gave the biggest reactions during the drum breaks of the songs he played, as well as often being the part of the song that dancers would wait for to start dancing. So in 1973, he had the idea of extending the drum break with 2 records of the same song and switching between them to extend it. And over the years, this idea would become more perfected, with people like Grandmaster Flash and Grand Wizard Theodore would expand on it with techniques like scratching and creating short performances on these records in what would become turntablism. The search for the perfect drum break to do this with would lead to records like The Funky Drummer and Apache, which became very popular choices for their drum breaks being used and manipulated by DJs, and it would become an integral part of hip-hop. Rather than having a dub version of the song to rap over like in Jamaica, the MCs in America would rap over instrumental funk, soul, and R&B music, and the DJ could perform turntablism tricks such as extending drum breaks or extending instrumental sections to hype up crowds and have the MC rap over the looped drum break in looped instrumental sections. This would develop into original records of people rapping over live instrumentation, such as Rapper's Delight and The Breaks. But affordable sampling technology wouldn't be readily available until the mid to late 80s, with samplers like the Emu SP1200 and the Akai MP60 giving hip-hop producers the ability to directly sample these songs in these drum breaks and use them in their hip-hop records. Before this point, the breakbeat only existed in the live sets of DJs. Now with the ability to sample, hip-hop producers no longer needed any formal music education to make their own beats to be rapped over. They only needed to have a good ear for sound collage and the patience to sample parts from multiple records and combine them into something new. And the DJs, who already had a large collection of popular dance records that they used on their sets, were the perfect people to make sampled beats for their MCs, the rappers, to rap over. The early sample-based hip-hop records would rely heavily on these drum breaks. You can hear the funky drummer and Apache all over them. With these two breaks being so foundational to hip-hop, surely they are the most sampled breakbeats of all time, right? Well, funky danceable drum breaks made sense in the early era of hip-hop that was typically of a faster tempo, less serious, and had lyrics that were about partying or otherwise a rapper bragging about their skills, as it was still following the legacy of Jamaican sound clash battles. But as the music became slower, more serious, and more contemplative, hip-hop of the 90s would move away from them, as it wouldn't be very fitting to use a happy dance drum break like the funky drummer over a more serious rap. So it had moved to other breaks that were groovy and complex, but not made for dancing, such as something like Impeach the President, or the Skull Snaps break. Who knew that James Brown bringing drum breaks into his 60s funk songs would evolve into something like this?
Interrupt this program to bring you an urgent message from the health department. House music, especially hip house music, has been banned due to the number of injuries caused by the extremely wild
No house
that it
music.
provokes.
No, we can't have that. I gotta do something.
As hip-hop evolved alongside electronic dance music with electro hip-hop using 808 drum machines instead of drum breaks, we would also see a fusion genre of hip house in the late 80s. While not all hip house sampled and some of them were just straight house songs with rapping, the sample sources for hip house differed from traditional hip-hop, which sampled over older black music like funk and R&B, then evolving to use other black genres like soul and jazz. Hip house instead sampled older electronic dance music, Kraftwerk, Yellow Magic Orchestra, electro songs like Planet Rock, and of course classic Chicago house, but typically also sampled funk drum breaks, the most common one in hip house being the sync break, named after the song Think About It by Lynn Collins in 1972. This break is notable because the song actually has 4 drum breaks, each one with different vocals caught within the loop, as well as the 5th break that is just a snare hit and a tambourine if you just want to use the tambourine by itself. The biggest hip house hits being songs like It Takes Two, Pump Up the Volume, and Pump Up the Jam, which interpolated the chords to move your body. A genre evolving from hip house in the early 90s was Baltimore Club, also called B-More Club, B-More House, or just B-More. While this genre also sampled sync breaks in early house music, it was a lot harsher and grittier at 130 BPM, and almost always had a kick pattern that was called the B-More clave, fusing the 4 on the floor pattern with the clave pattern by having 2 quarter note kicks and then a tresillo. This style would eventually evolve into Jersey Club in the early 2000s, which is where it would really take off internationally. Another subgenre of house evolving with the hip house scene is ghetto house, typically faster and more raw, with more explicit and sexual subject matter, which eventually evolved into the genre called footwork or juke, which played tresillo kick patterns at 160 BPM and had crazy footwork dances associated with it. Also developing in the late 80s is the genre of New Jack Swing. Developed by producer Teddy Riley, it was a pop-accessible fusion of many black dance genres like funk, R&B, hip-hop, and house, and it also really loved orchestral hits. It brought back the type of James Brown funk breakbeats, but typically played by a drum machine or were sampled. They had FM synth bass lines derived from funk, brass and horn melodies inspired by classic 1940s big band swing, and singing that was either rap or slower R&B singing, typically about love. And of course the sync break. Hip house inspired music just really loved the sync break. As a heavily used FM synthesis for its sound, it surprisingly translated really well to the FM sound chip of the Sega Genesis, and was a huge source of inspiration for Genesis video game music, the genre often associated with Sonic the Hedgehog. Well, more so the music of Sonic 3, which Michael Jackson worked on. Sonic 1's music drew more from Yellow Magic Orchestra than anything else. Moving away from hip-hop, but important to understand before talking about rave, is Italo house. Evolving from Italo disco came house music with a huge focus on the piano, taking it further than Chicago house ever did, and developing it into a science, as well as diva vocals, both of which can be heard on the Italo house hit Right on Time, which sampled the acapella from Love Sensation. The distinct house piano sound came from the Korg M1 synths, which came out in 1988. Most synthesizers did not have very realistic piano synthesis, so the Korg M1, which actually used samples, became the piano sound of choice, as well as the Korg M1 Organ 2 preset, which was heavily used in bassline and chords in house music. Now we have to go to the United Kingdom, where rave music was developing from late 80s acid house into a faster, more aggressive hardcore dance sound. Going by many names, this early sound was called breakbeat hardcore, UK rave, or just rave. Rather than using drum machines, they would sample funk breakbeats and speed them up from 120 to 160 BPM, increasing their pitch and making crowds go wild. These genres would just loop the breaks as it is for the duration of the entire song while adding some rave stabs, which were often sampled synth chords played like a melody. They could also have Italo house pianos and lots of samples. Sampling technology was finally at the point that you could load lots of ready-made samples, with a lot of these being single phrases repeated rhythmically like early Chicago house, but often sampled lines from other sources such as lines from action movies. The big sampler synth for this was the Roland W30, which could have multiple samples at the ready laid across the piano roll. With faster songs, you would have a lot of samples sped up and therefore pitched up. The songs would often sample the pianos too, sometimes from older music, which was then sped up and pitched up, older house and Italo house songs, or even other rave songs. This is where groups like The Prodigy first started before helping to create the genre of big beat in the late 90s.
And do my own thing, switch up, change my pitch up, smack my bitch up.
Along groups like Chemical Brothers and Fatboy Slim. Big Beat would focus on, of course, breakbeats, but also distorted and acid bass lines with heavy sample manipulation to take small bits from other songs and turn them into something new. It is very accessible, and the genre is heard a lot in late 90s video games and action movies. A big development at the time was home computers with sample-based sound chips, such as the Amiga 500 and Atari ST. But the development of specialized computer music software that took full advantage of the sample capabilities would come trackers, which were built around the use of repitching and rearranging samples loaded onto it. This meant that with a small amount of samples you could build entire songs without eating into storage space. This would allow for many more musicians to arrive at the rave scene, as you no longer needed any specific synthesizers or instruments or products to make music. You could instead program on your home computer. With the advent of rave would also come Eurodance, an evolution of high energy that merged elements of rave and hip house. Eurodance played the house pattern of a 4/4 kick drum with an open hi-hat on the offbeat, then either cheesy bubblegum pop singing or rapping, sometimes both. Eurodance is usually completely built around a melodic hook, often having a singer sing the melody, then have a synth repeat the melody, then play both at the same time, and so forth. Often uses high energy octave jumping bass lines and is usually at a higher tempo of 140 BPM. It's a lot simpler and more accessible than rave, and because the focus is on catchy melodies and happy lyrics, it's often very catchy. The breakbeat hardcore sound would develop into two different styles, one taking the sound of rave even further with the genre of happy hardcore in the mid-90s, going even faster and more cheesy, with a focus on happy uplifting vocals and melodies, as well as some faster and more manipulated breakbeats. And then the genre that focused on the breakbeats, Jungle, which would take these breaks and highly manipulate them, chopping them up and rearranging them to make new beats entirely. The melodies were stripped away, and all the music had was complex drum rhythms playing over deep, powerful bass lines evolving from bleep techno and Jamaican sound systems. Sometimes they would use V-spaces or sampled 808 kicks that were then re-pitched up and down to make bass lines. Wagga Jungle specifically was developed by Jamaican immigrants in the UK who would toast and rap over these songs that were nothing but complex drums and heavy bass, which is why it would eventually develop the scene we now call drum and bass. This type of Jamaican toasting was developed from sound system clashes but became its own music in the 80s, in the genre of dancehall. Dancehall being 80s reggae but faster with sound clash toasting over it, which in the late 80s evolved into Wagga, reggae without the E. Wagga is a more hardcore dancehall with digital instrumentation going faster and using lots of sampling as influenced by hip-hop. Dancehall style rapping can be heard in a lot of UK hip house and Eurodance, and its influence has spread to many genres, not so different from rap. Wagga Jungle would typically use lots of Wagga tropes and samples, often referencing sound clash culture in songs by mentioning selectors and similar sound system terms. It is in this type of music where thousands of records are created using a small collection of drum breaks for all of them. The Funky Drummer and Apache were popular choices, but the two-door Advisor Dominance or Lynn Collins' Think About It, the second most sampled song of all time, and Amen Brother by the Winstons, the most sampled song of all time. But why these two? In fact, the Funky Drummer sped up sounds a lot like the Amen break, as proven by all the people confusing the two with each other. And the Apache is longer and seems to have more complexity. Well, let's start with a sync break. While other drum breaks are one bar looped endlessly, this song has 4, technically 5, drum breaks. When sped up to around 160 BPM, the typical speed of jungle, it goes up around 6 semitones and sounds like this. So you already have 4 variations of the same drum rhythm, allowing people to pick and choose kicks, snares, and snare rolls from any of the 4 breaks. If you wanted a break without any vocals, you could take a kick, often the kick from break 3 as it hits the hardest, and layer on top of the kick of break 2 and use break 2 snares. It's very interesting that this little vocal shouts just so happen to be caught within the breaks. You would think they were undesirable, but over time producers came to love these vocals and would often just keep them in, or use them completely removed from the drums at all.
Inject respect, collect a fat check, heaven's in effect, but you ain't heard nothing yet.
Compared to Funky Drummer, Apache, or Amen, the sync break is actually the simplest construction-wise, as it's just a kick in the 4th quarter, a strong snare hit on the 2nd, a snare roll of 3 smaller snare hits in the 3rd quarter, and a final strong snare hit on the last quarter. However, what that does is make it a lot easier to take out individual kicks and snares that you want and rearrange them, as they have a lot of empty space between them. Compare that to a more complex break, and trying to get a kick or a snare without accidentally getting something caught within it is more likely and therefore more difficult to cleanly take out. So the sync break was favored among these jungle and drum and bass producers because it has 4 variations of very clean and spaced out kicks, snares, snare rolls, and even small vocal shouts to mess with. In the high frequency range is a tambourine. However, it is very easy to remove if desired by EQing out the highest frequencies, or to use a tambourine of the 5th break if you want it by itself. The Amen break is actually 4 bars long. And when sped up to 160 BPM, it goes up 4 semitones and sounds like this. You definitely recognize the loop of bar 2, which is used by itself without manipulation in a lot of hip-hop and breakbeat hardcore records. But that is not actually the reason why it is the most sampled drum break. It's actually because of this part toward the end. This kick and ride, or D kick and ride symbol that you hear in heavily manipulated Amen breaks. Then you have a small snare roll, a double kick leading into a longer snare roll, and a crash. This here already gives you more than the sync. The sync has clean kick, snares, and snare rolls, while the Amen gives you all of that as well as the clean kick roll, ride, and crash. More of the drum kit for you to use. And of course you can pull from bar 2 if you want more variation. None of the other popular breaks feature a ride cymbal, sometimes featuring a hi-hat or a tambourine, and the ride, relative to other elements like hi-hats and tambourines, is louder and has much stronger energy, giving the Amen a constant level of energy throughout even between the kicks and snares, which can be used to extend sections while still keeping energy. So many people who wanted to make fast music preferred it over a break of lots of empty space between it. With all of these elements in just this end bit of the 4-bar loop, producers can rearrange them to extend the Amen continuously with constant variation in ways other drum breaks simply cannot. This is why the Amen has become the most sampled drum break and the most sampled song of all time. A good example song would be Renegade Terrorist. Here the song directly samples the bass line from Reese, EQing out all the higher frequencies, then plays a sample at different pitches to make a bass line. Then comes in the end bit of the Amen break, with the kick and ride repeated twice at the end. Then on top of that is the sync break, rearranged to repeat the snare roll multiple times before ending on the strong snare on the 4th hit. As the music develops, we see people re-pitching parts of the break, such as the Amen snare, and making more variations in the new sample patterns, making pitched up and down snare rolls, for example. These techniques would also see themselves brought over into happy hardcore music as well, which would also create entirely new and glitchy drum patterns out of drum samples. However, it originated with Ragga Jungle, the first jungle of them all. Jungle and drum and bass did use Amen the most. However, there is still a lot of great and popular records using many other drum breaks, and to act like the Amen is the only one is a huge disservice to the genre as a whole. Here are some examples of other drum breaks and songs that use them. Later on, drum and bass music evolved to the point that you would have people fuse elements of multiple drum breaks together, with breaks like the Trayman, which fuses the Amen break with the Flow break from the Alex Reese mix of Model 500 The Flow, and the Samurai break from Photek 7 Samurai, which itself was a rearrangement of the Tighten Up break from a James Brown record. As jungle evolved over the years, it would move away from its Ragga influences and develop new forms. There was atmospheric jungle or atmospheric drum and bass, which focused on big synth pads for harmony and took jungle to a more relaxing and psychedelic field. The big name in atmospheric jungle is LTJ Bukem. Also, drum and bass, or D&B for short, would use sampled breakbeats but also a lot of complex drum machine patterns at around the same speed of 160 to 180 BPM. Some people consider jungle and drum and bass to mean the same thing, while others refer to jungle as their earlier music with more Ragga influences and strictly breakbeat samples, and drum and bass as a later development of D&B in the 2000s becoming more predominantly programmed drums instead of samples, but still keep the focus on heavy bass lines, big atmospheric pads, and crazy syncopated drum patterns. The way that trackers were made lent themselves to drum and bass, as often all you had to do was load a breakbeat sample and a deep dub bass for the bass line, and of course lush pads loaded into the sampler if you were making atmospheric music. That isn't to say that the Ragga influence is gone, as even today there will still be drum and bass songs featuring fast Ragga rapping and old Ragga samples. Most interestingly is the fusion genre of Bang Ragga, a fusion of Bhangra and Ragga. Bhangra is the pop music developing from traditional Punjabi folk music by the UK descendants of immigrant Punjabi populations in Pakistan and northern India in the 70s and 80s, fusing their traditional sounds of Western music. The UK scene of ethnic Punjabi people meeting with ethnic Jamaican people would develop music like that of Punjabi MCs Joji. Industrial music is an experimental style of music that draws on harsh and transgressive sounds, first developing in the 70s in the UK and Germany, influenced by musique concrète, krautrock, and noise. The style of music differed vastly between artists, and is too broad to cover here, but the main idea behind it was to use non-musical elements and non-instruments to make music, exploring dark themes of the industrial sounds and rebellious philosophy. Coming out of this in the 80s would be the genre of EBM, short for electronic body music, pioneered by acts like DIF and Front 242. While they would use a lot of similar industrial sound design, it evolved to use synthesizers to develop dark and distinctly German sounds and rhythms, with repetitive synth bassline and unique industrial percussion in the drum, making a more danceable form of industrial while still drawing from Kraftwerk and their philosophies but in a completely different way than Detroit techno. Some of this EBM influence can be heard in Depeche Mode's mid-80s work, and other UK synthpop acts. In Germany, this type of music would be referred to by some as techno, though it wasn't a completely accepted and used term. Detroit techno came to Germany in the late 80s, same as it did in the UK. After the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, underground techno rave parties exploded in East Berlin, just as big as they did in the UK rave scene, helping to unite West and East Berlin after so long separated, and Berlin became the techno capital of Europe. There became discourse over which techno was the real techno, the techno in Detroit or the techno in EBM clubs in Germany, with some referring to the German techno as techno with 2 Ks, or they referred to Detroit techno as techno house. Many second-wave Detroit techno producers, frustrated with the lack of opportunity and attention in their own home country, moved to Germany, where there was a lot more attention and opportunity for them, specifically Jeff Mills and Blake Baxter, leading to a compilation album titled Tresor 2, Berlin and Detroit, a Techno Alliance, in 1993, a celebration of the two cities and their contributions to techno, leading to some collaborations between American and German artists. With this, we would see techno go full circle and return to the home of Kraftwerk, often considered the true origin of techno. The German techno influence of industrial and EBM changed the development of techno going forward, as seen with Jeff Mills' work, as they would also develop a focus on industrial sound design going forward, as well as the subgenre of industrial techno, which is exactly what it sounds like. Warp Records was a record label created in 1989 and distributed bleep techno, and released a compilation album Artificial Intelligence in 1992, featuring music from acts like Autechre, Aphex Twin, and The Orb. Artificial Intelligence contained experimental and rhythmically complex music that wasn't really suitable for dancing to in the club, suggesting that it was more for home listening. This was referred to as ambient techno or intelligent techno in the beginning, but as it didn't strictly follow the style of techno, it was eventually called intelligent dance music, or IDM for short. While the idea of IDM was more unified at the beginning, over the years more and more artists would sign onto Warp Records and be labeled as IDM, but had completely different sounds, such as Boards of Canada, which made experimental down-tempo music exploring feelings of nostalgia, but was more inspired by 70s commercial jingles and porn music than anything in the rave scene, and Square Pusher, who fused drum and bass with jazz fusion. IDM is now more of an umbrella term for such acts that have signed to Warp Records and do not fit with other electronic music categories, while still having a strong rhythmic and dance element to it. One subcategory of IDM is drill and bass, which uses even more complex, glitchy, and fast drum programming than a drum and bass, often using strange time signatures if any at all, with percussion glitch to the point that it sounds like broken electronics at times. It's called drill and bass because some of the percussive rolls go so fast that it sounds like a drill or jackhammer. Both Aphex Twin and Square Pusher have dabbled in drill and bass music. Developing in the early 90s was waves that kept getting faster and harsher. While breakbeat hardcore is relatively tame, hardcore techno, or just hardcore, came with people running 909 kick drums through guitar distortion pedals and pumping the power of the 4-on-the-floor kick drum to levels unprecedented at speeds of up to 200 BPM, and then layered 909 snares and claps on top of the kicks to make them hit even harder. This culminated in the Netherlands with the music known as gabber, aiming to be the most hardcore of them all, heavily relying on the 909 for the kick and syncopated rhythms on snares, hi-hats, and other percussion lines with synth melodies, often not using a bass line at all, or using the distorted gabber 909 kick drum as the bass line. In 1992, there became an annual music festival and compilation series called Thunderdome, collecting all the hardcore gabber heads together. They developed a gabber subculture in the Netherlands, with people who shaved their heads bald, wore tracksuits, and took ecstasy and speed. They did a dance called Haken, where they threw their legs up in the air in sync with the kicks. They saw doing drugs and dancing to gabber as a spiritual, transcending experience, going even faster with speedcore, a genre developing in the mid-90s in the race to make the fastest and hardest music, going between 300 and 600 BPM. Splittercore has BPMs between 600 and 1000 BPM, with kicks that sound like minigun fire, also called nosebleed techno. And finally, Extra Tone, music with BPMs above 1000 that has kicks going so fast that they become indistinguishable from each other, making it an extra tone. I'll stop now. Digital hardcore fuses hardcore punk with hardcore techno, often using breakbeats and chiptune sounds, defined by acts like Atari Teenage Riot. They would heavily use the aim break as opposed to a 4-on-the-floor pattern, which they said was because the constant march of the 4-on-the-floor pattern was too much like a Nazi march. Neo-Nazis tried to infiltrate the hardcore music scene and call it their own, and Atari Teenage Riot was a heavily left-leaning group with many anti-fascist songs to push against neo-Nazis. Also in the hardcore scene is breakcore, which takes the manipulated breakbeat samples of jungle and drum and bass and brings them into hardcore, going at much faster BPMs and intentionally overwhelms the listener with the complexity of the breakbeat pattern. And unlike other drum and bass genres, it doesn't loop patterns. Instead, it keeps evolving new drum patterns over the course of the song. Very similar and often confused with drill and bass, but drill and bass uses drum programming while breakcore uses samples. But the sample percussion hits in breakcore will do similar glitchy rolls that sound like drills. Again, the most common one being the aim and break, but other breakbeats are also heard across the genres such as the Think, Apache, Funky Drummer, and others. There's also a lot of variation within the term breakcore. For example, some of the digital hardcore music can be considered breakcore, with possibly the earliest being Alec Empire's The Destroyer from 1996, Alec being the founding member of Atari Teenage Riot and the creator of digital hardcore. Square Pusher can also be considered breakcore, with some of the intense speed and glitchiness heard on some of the tracks, but while some go hard, others are more down-tempo and slower in BPM. Square Pusher's album from 1996 was called Feed Me Weird Things. Coming out the same year as The Destroyer, it is also a contender for the first breakcore album. Christoph's If You're Into It, I'm Out of It from 1997 fuses dark ambient and drone with evolving breakbeats in 1997 and can be seen as another early progenitor. A subgenre of breakcore is ragacore, breakcore that more closely follows the influence of raga jungle, with its samples and raga singing. Another breakcore producer is Phoenician Snares, which did harsh breakcore sounds with samples and heavy distortion starting in 1998, but in 2005 came out with Ross Sealag, which sampled and rearranged many classical songs and threw breakcore on top of it, with most of the album in 7/4 time, which helped put breakcore on the map with its unique fusion of classical music and breakcore. Others evolved into a more happy hardcore and mashup sound, using many other songs and samples in the music to throw the audience off guard and aim for a more humorous and fun sound, developing around 2004 with acts like Sick Boy and Shit Match. While the genre was already sample heavy, this subgenre of mashcore, mashup breakcore, focuses on fusing popular but unexpected songs together with breakcore, which would gain popularity online with internet-focused mashup artists like Renard and Goreshit. Related to mashups is the genre of plunderphonics, an experimental form of sound collage exploring the limits, legality, and complete reinterpretation of sampling through their work, coined by John Oswald, who released the album Plunderphonic in 1989, where each song only used material by one artist. For example, the song Dab, which was a complete rearrangement of Michael Jackson's Bad. In 1993 released Plexture, which goes even further in using hundreds of samples in a single song. While hip-hop typically uses 1 or 2 samples for songs, sometimes going up to 4 or 5, DJ Shadow started to make an instrumental hip-hop album made entirely of samples, which he made in 1996 with only an Akai MPC-60 using a large collection of cheap records he collected. While John Oswald's work was more of an experiment, DJ Shadow made it musical, using over 100 samples across the whole album. In house music, we would see an evolving genre of disco house, which would usually sample one loop from a disco or funk song and then build a house song around it. But then would come the genre of French house, which added filter sweeps and developed the loops with more manipulation. The big example of this is Daft Punk's Discovery in 2003, which did more advanced sample manipulation to make some of their songs, a love letter to old disco and funk music. Developing from these production techniques would come Electro House, also called Swedish House, because of acts like Eric Prydz and the members of Swedish House Mafia. But it is defined by the 2007 album Cross by Justice, who evolved the French house sound with big synths and more polished and tight production, while still using lots of disco era and style samples, but not completely relying on them, being more transformative. A subgenre of electro house is complextro, a combination of complex and electro which utilize glitchy chopped up rhythms. But please don't confuse electro house or electro clash with 80s electro, please. Also pushing the Plunderphonics idea was Onyx Point Never under the alias of Chuck Person, releasing some loops and music videos on the YouTube channel Sunset Corp in 2009, with the first two Vaporwave songs being Angel and Nobody Here. Then in 2010 releasing Echo Jam, an exercise in Plunderphonics using chopped and screwed methods and often looping songs in very strange ways. Rather than be clean loops, they would feel a lot dirtier and almost like a mistake with the hard cuts. The next year, released under Onyx Point Never, is the album Replica, further defining the idea of Vaporwave with its more complex production and ambient glitch tendencies. This would proceed into a lot of Plunderphonic subgenres of Vaporwave, such as Muzakcore or Mallsoft, focusing more on the sound of smooth jazz and commercial music, with the name Muzak referring to an old American company from the 30s that made music with the intention of being background music for offices, restaurants, and stores, citing studies that undistracting background music helps productivity. Since they are made for passive listening, vocals and complexity were avoided. This is also known as elevated music, which was also stole by Muzak, basically aiming to be the most inoffensive music possible, with smooth jazz being the background music of choice in the 90s. This was often the source of samples in Vaporwave. There was also subgenres like Utopian Virtual, defined by Farsight Virtual in 2011, which didn't rely on background music samples, but instead emulating the sounds of 90s computers, ringtones, and simulation games like Second Life and SimCity. Vapor Trap, like Blink Banshee, which adds trap drums and bass lines to Vaporwave samples, and Future Funk, which was pioneered by acts like St. Pepsi and Macross 8299, which is yet another deviation from Funchhouse. But while Funchhouse sampled funk and disco, Future Funk instead sampled 80s anime music, disco bass lines, and city pop, with city pop being the style of 80s Japanese pop music following the extreme popularity of Yellow Magic Orchestra, taking influence from them and their use of synth funk and exotica, but also adding jazz and lounge music elements. Another case of electronic music going full circle. Future Funk is basically a fusion of Funchhouse and Vaporwave, but still more reliant on samples and less transformative than Funchhouse, in my opinion anyway. With exceptions like Utopian Virtual and other small subgroups, Vaporwave is heavily sample reliant, and used them as an artistic statement much like Plunderphonics, exploring the line between transformative work and stealing. Also coming along in the 90s was video games that could actually store CD quality music, no longer needing to synthesize the music on the 8-bit and 16-bit sound chips, leading to many video games to feature music inspired by wave and other 90s dance genres, as energetic dance music is often a good choice of fast-paced energetic video games. A common genre was drum and bass, which is heavily associated with 90s racing games, but also games like Unreal Tournament, System Shock 2, Bomberman Hero, Ape Escape, Street Fighter 3, and many more. We would also see heavy house and Eurobeat influence, such as the house piano playing on Sonic or Smash Brothers. There is a lot more I could cover, but I decided to stop here, in the 90s. With all that I covered here, you should be able to more easily follow and understand any other genre developed in the 21st century and where its influences might have come from. Above all else, I wanted this video to explore the lineages of influence, to help people see who influenced who, to show how all of these vastly different styles of music draw from each other, which is why I didn't spend a lot of time on outliers of people who didn't pioneer a sound one way or another. Music doesn't come from nothing. It all follows ideas put by the people before them, and don't be afraid to draw from that. This research project of mine came from a deep love and respect for this music, and I wanted to share it with others, as unfortunately a lot of music nerd culture that I've interacted with just doesn't care or respect dance music. But dance music is some of the most important music of all. Throughout its history, it's united and uplifted people, brought different cultures and people together, one nation under a groove. It inspired innovation and technology. It helped marginalized groups rebel and make a statement. It has drawn from cultures all over the world who all had an important part in it. From former Axis powers that found a new love and pride in their nationalities through music, like Germany, Japan, and Italy, to marginalized immigrant communities in the US and UK uniting through it. Dance music has explored many complex emotions, not just simple happy or sad ones, from complex harmonies and rhythms to unheard of sound design, and it would find the soul in the machine. If you liked any of the music you heard here, I urge you to look into these artists, as I like and recommend pretty much all of the songs I used in the video. The video already has a lot of copyright claims, so there's no guarantee it will stay as it is. It might be muted or blocked in some places. That's also why I often talk over the music, as talking over it prevents it from getting claimed. But there is still a chance the video will be taken down, so you have my blessing to download or re-upload it to other places in case it does get taken down. I just couldn't properly show the history without using all the music that I did. I also will absolutely not get ad revenue for this 2-hour endeavor of passion. So if this video helped you at all, even just finding more music that you love, consider supporting me on Ko-Fi or buying my albums on Bandcamp. They're all like $3 each. Very amateur stuff, I'm self-taught, but you know. I love comments and will respond to them. I don't have a lot of people to talk about this stuff because no one else listens to my kind of music. Hopefully this video will change that. And you can also talk to me on Twitter or Discord. This is Forrest Whitaker Topa, signing out.